Hello, this is Russell Moore, and this is Reading in Exile, which several of you have said, when is Reading in Exile going to come back? Sorry, I was occupied with finishing a big writing project and starting a new one. But someone suggested on Instagram that I talk about this book, which is Leon Kass's The Beginning of Wisdom, which is about reading Genesis. And the reason was because I had mentioned that I was reading Kass's new book on Exodus and talking about how influential this book had been on my thought. It was on my list of the 20 best books of the last 20 years. And it really when I think about books that really have lingered with me in terms of ideas for a long period of time, this book is up there on that list. Kass is not a Christian; he's a Jewish philosopher. He served as chairman of President Bush's Council on Bioethics. Writes a lot of really interesting things, but there are images and arguments in this book, beginning of wisdom, that are are extraordinary in terms of the way that Cass deals with Genesis, not so much as a theological text, but as a literary work. And so he's coming in, he's looking at themes in Genesis, and he's relating those themes to the rest of the Old Testament. In when I'll tell you some of the things that really stood out to me as I was reading this. One of them had to do with the way he ties Genesis 1 to the rest of Genesis. So he says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's a narrator who is feeling no obligation to identify himself at all. There's no build up to who is God. God is, and then moves from there. And he talks about how later on in Genesis, you will see, for instance, God never explaining himself to Abram in a way of defining who or he is. Something similar to what you're going to see later on in Exodus, when Moses says, "Who should I tell Pharaoh sent me? I am that which I am." There's that theme of hearing the word of the self-existent God that Cass picks up on throughout the text of Genesis, and he takes it up in contrast to sight of the skies. Looking at an ancient Near Eastern context of a lot of moon worship and star worship, and talks about how the natural human tendency without a word from God would be to look to the skies and to see the sweeping vision of the constellations, and to deify that, and to worship that. So Cass emphasizes that. He also emphasizes quite a bit the necessity of the need for a word to define nature. So God is creator of nature. He defines it to be good, and yet a nature itself, just looking at nature by itself and not going from nature to the creator, as Paul would talk about in Romans 1, would lead to a twisted sense of what's right and what's wrong. He talks about the tree in terms of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And why is this a tree? Now, he says part of the issue is that a tree on its own seems to be existing, seems to be self sufficient, seems to grow on its own unless you know otherwise. And so, what's happening with Adam and Eve is the seeing of themselves that way. They're able to take from this tree and to know on their own good from evil. Important, thought provoking idea there. Also, in terms of the serpent, now Cass would not agree with me as a Christian about the identity of the serpent. later on in Revelation, identified with the figure of Satan. But he talks about how, if you'll notice, serpents are often deified in various pagan religions as being gods of wisdom, and they're also feared. They're also seen as threatening creatures. And he says the reason for that is because the serpent gives a picture of hyper rationality and veracity. So he says you've got the sense of the serpent, this unblinking sort of cunning looking creature. I find snakes terrifying. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But that sense of hyper rationality, along with the fact that a snake is basically one long digestive tract. So there's this sense of appetite unhinged from God, and a sense of reason, cunning, as Genesis would say, unhinged from God. That has stayed with me. I think about that all the time. I've cited it several places. Also, where he talks about after the fall, and again, I'm reading that as a Christian in a way he wouldn't see it, but he talks about the sense of being naked and ashamed. Why that is, and it's because he argues that what the man and the woman are recognizing in their nakedness is that they are not self existent. They are complementary to one another. The human race cannot go forward without someone else outside of me. So there is a sense of a recognition of death and of finiteness. He makes this argument in a way that, just grappling with how he's wording this, really affected me when he talks about the flood of Noah. And in Genesis 6, the part that's really debated by Jewish thinkers, Christian thinkers throughout the centuries, these men of great renown, the Nephilim. What he is arguing is that the flood wipes away this sense of heroism in the way that you see it with Nimrod and with Lamech and with the mighty men of great renown. That pagan sense of heroism as strength and swagger. Instead, what survives the judgment of God is faith and obedience in the person of Noah and his family, not heroism. And so that sense of that sense of redefining the heroic has stayed with me. The imagery that he uses, picking up on the way that Noah sends out the dove and the raven, and he says, you see the raven hovering over the deep, Genesis 1 2. A raven, of course, being something that feeds off of carrion. And when it doesn't come back, that's not a good sign. Um, what he's arguing here is that this is an indication, it's sort of almost a foreshadowing of the fact that the wildness of post-fall humanity, again, that's in my Christian terms, not in his, but that wildness is still there. So this isn't utopia. This isn't this new start. Doesn't mean that you've somehow undone Eden. Really provocative point with Babel when he talks about the naming of the animals related to the use of language. Come and let us build. And he talks about how there's this distinction between God and humanity, where God is able to speak logos, word, call things directly into existence. Humanity has a linguistic world that is derivative from that. It can't ultimately create in the way that God can. So when there's a confusion between the linguistic world and the objective world, one ends up with a sense of idolatry. And he talks about how the map is not the territory. And this was fascinating to me because I really have spent a lot of time thinking about the way that Kass talks about logos and the way that Kass talks about the speech and hearing as it relates to the prologue of John, which I think is one of the most important passages of Scripture. Cass, of course, doesn't talk about that or see that, but it's an important point. And so there's it's so many points here he goes through, and he ties together all of Genesis in a literary way, even to when we get to Joseph. And he talks about, for instance, Egypt as being a place that deifies technology, building of these storage cities, without personal transformation, and the creation of this lush fake Eden, derived from the Nile. But in Egypt, what one has is a man who does not see himself as the image of God, but who sees himself as a God in Pharaoh. And God is demonstrating the folly of that in Genesis, all the way through to at the very ending of Genesis, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I preached about it years ago and have thought about it a lot ever since. The oath that Joseph makes his brothers swear to carry his bones back to the land of promise, which becomes important later on in Exodus as well. uh, uh, Cass talks about the difference between this sense of the of Israel of burial, as opposed to cremation on the one hand, which disregards the importance of the body. The body is just a carrier, and mummification in Egypt on the other hand, which represents this deification of the body. He says instead, the perspective that we have in Genesis is a respect and an honor of the body and a returning of the body to the earth. Um, so the book is just it's really fascinating, and you won't agree with everything that Cass is saying, of course, but it's going to give you often a way of having a new perspective of asking yourself some questions and then tracing out the answers, often in different ways than Cass does. But it really, really is. It's one of those books that stays with you for a long time. I'm reading the Exodus book right now. I'll let you know what I think later on. But beginning of wisdom, reading Genesis, really important work. This is Russell Moore, and this is Reading in Exile. Let me know what you would like for me to talk about here in the comments.